What's up, everybody? Welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Mick. So I know that some of you have talked about wanting to go tiny, but you don't want to live 2 hours outside of a major city. If that's you, this is a great video for you today because we're talking about where you can park a tiny home in Portland, Oregon, so within city limits. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and also make sure you watch to the end so you can find out whether or not Portland is the best option for you to go tiny. Let's get into it. Let's talk about where you can park your tiny house in Portland. Alright, welcome back. So today we're talking about where you can park a tiny house in Portland, and overall we're just kind of talking about whether or not Portland, Oregon is the best place for you to potentially go tiny. So we're thinking about where to put a tiny house. We talked about this a little bit on the channel, but there's 3 main places. So you can either put it in your backyard or your friend's backyard. You can get vacant land, depending on where you're planning on putting the tiny house. You can put it on that vacant lot, or you can put it in a tiny house community. But specifically when we're talking about Portland, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because there's a couple of things that Portland has going for it, and the state of Oregon as well too, that help make it an ideal place for you to go tiny. So there's 3 main things you want to consider in general when you're considering moving to a particular place. So we're looking at the tiny house laws in Portland and Oregon today. We're looking at the weather and the climate. I know that's a big one for those of you who have talked about natural disasters and whether or not tiny houses just hold up under certain conditions. And then we're also going to talk about tiny house communities and culture, which is a big one. So we're looking at the tiny house laws in Oregon. This is coming out of the state of Oregon. They did a brief on their tiny house regulations back in 2019. So they broke it down into 3 different types of uses for tiny homes. So either a permanent dwelling, so that's attached to a foundation. They got temporary dwellings, so that's built on the chassis and the frame. That's sort of what we're used to seeing in the tiny house industry. So that would be like a tiny house on wheels or a throw. And then there's also the transitional tiny house. So that's for people that don't have shelter, and that depends on the location. The city determines that one. So the tiny house laws in Oregon, so you zoom out, we'll start with Oregon and then I'll talk about Portland. So the tiny house laws in Oregon, they're divided up into different types of codes. So there's an Oregon Residential Specialty Code. Under that code, you have to be licensed by the state for the home. It's got to be less than 600 square feet, but you can put it on a land for a single family home. So the zoning is what we have to pay the most attention to for any part of this country when it comes to where you can put your tiny house. So they also have an Oregon Small Home Specialty Code. So that's for a single family residence up to 400 square feet. So the good thing about the laws in Oregon is that you can actually have a smaller dwelling as long as the land is zoned for single family homes. You have ADUs, which for the most part y'all are familiar with now after watching a couple of the interviews on this channel. So that's 1 per single family home. And then there's also something called a cottage cluster, which I thought was really interesting. So there's 4 more detached units. They can be up to 900 square feet and they have a shared courtyard. So that's kind of like a little bit different than a standard tiny house village or tiny house community because you can have just 4 of them. But I figured that that's a pretty cool model that some of y'all might be interested in as well too. When you move over to Portland, sort of like zooming into Portland, it's mostly looking at tiny houses on wheels. So they're actually considered occupied recreational vehicles. You can have 1 on a lot with a house. Religious institutions can have more of them, but you can't put them on undeveloped lots. So this is an important one. I know some of you are interested in buying land. So if you're interested in buying land in Portland, just know that you can't put a tiny house on that undeveloped lot. And they're not allowed as accessory short-term rentals either, and they've got to be under 600 square feet. But the plus is that you can put them on land for a single family home. So the reason why I want to talk about Portland in particular, in addition to the laws, so the laws seem to be really tiny house friendly for the state of Oregon and then the city of Portland as well too, but the climate is kind of the big one. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pacific Northwest and with Portland in particular, the winters are really mild, right? So it doesn't snow very often. When it does, it doesn't stay for very long. It doesn't get below freezing or stay at freezing for very long either. You're dealing with rain versus snow, which depending on your builder is more ideal. You'll have to talk to them about that, obviously, to make sure it's considering the rain and like how much rain falls in that area. You will have to make sure that the home is like weatherproof for that, but you're also going to have less 100+ days. So if you're considering like Portland versus Arizona, that's 2 different, very different climates. You have to consider the weather there. I think Arizona had over like 100 consecutive days of like 100 degrees or more. So all those things will factor into your build as well too. But just know the climate in general is pretty mild, at least for a tiny home. When you're looking at the tiny house communities and the culture, this is kind of a big one. So this is something I would suggest that y'all do regardless of where you want to live. It's just thinking about whether or not these areas are tiny house friendly. It's more than the laws. You also have to think about whether or not there's communities in the area, whether the culture is tiny house friendly. So if you're looking at the state of Oregon, it's a plus because you do have quite a few tiny house communities. So you have Tiny Tranquility, which I've had here on the channel. You can check out their video. They're on the coast. You've got Mount Hood, Tiny Village. You've got Tiny Digs, which is a tiny house hotel. You also have Simply Home Community in Portland, and then you have Agape PDX, which is a transitional housing shelter, which I've also had on the channel. So just that wide range. You have everything from tiny house communities to villages in the city, within city limits, hotels, and then you also have the facilities or the transitional housing shelters too. When you're looking at builders, there's quite a few in the state of Oregon, a couple within Portland as well too. You have Tiny Mountain Houses, which I've had on the channel before, Stanley Tiny Homes, which is based out of Portland, True Form Tiny, which is a little further out of the city, and then you have Spindrift, and you have Tiny Heirloom, which a lot of you might be familiar with because that's the same company from Tiny Luxury from HGTV a few years back. So in general, if you look at all those factors, if you look at the climate, you look at the laws, you look at the community, you look at the culture, I would say that Portland is one of the best places to go tiny. Now, it's going to depend heavily on your personal preferences, right? Do you want to live in the Pacific Northwest? Do you want to live within city limits? But this was a big one, right? Because I feel like a lot of y'all have been talking about how you don't want to live in a really, really rural or isolated area. So Portland is one of the few cities in this country where you can actually go tiny and you'll still be within a city. So that's just something that I wanted y'all to consider. So that's why I figured I'd bring it up. But overall, obviously I want to know what y'all think. Like, do you feel like it's worth it to you to potentially consider this part of the country? And again, it's a really beautiful area. So, in terms of what you have access to, you'll have like a pretty urban space, not super, super dense like some of the major cities you might see in the US. You're not too far from more rural areas if you want to go experience things where you feel a little more, not as congested, if you will. You're about 90 minutes from the beach, so you're not too far from the coast, depending on what you're used to. But yeah, I want to know what you think. Would you consider going tiny in this area? What do you think about the laws? Do you feel like that makes sense for you and what you're looking for? Have you considered whether or not you would want a tiny house on foundation? These are all really important questions for you to sort of like ask yourselves, but I just wanted to present this state as an option. I'm considering looking at other states as well too. So if there's another state that you're interested in me sort of doing a similar video about, just let me know. But yeah, make sure you check out the video I did with Tiny Tranquility, which is based on the Oregon coast, Central Oregon coast. It's a tiny house community, but it's a good example of sort of like the options that you have available to you. It's a little bit further outside the city. So if you're interested in within city limits, I would say look into obviously Portland proper or Metro. But if you're willing to drive a couple hours, I think it's about 2 hours away from the city, then Tiny Tranquility potentially could be a good option for you too. But yeah, I want to know what you guys think. Make sure you drop comments, ask questions. I love hearing from you guys. I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this video. And yeah, don't forget to think tiny, and I will see you guys in the next one.